I discovered my sister-in-law on a nanny cam telling my son that she was his real mother, but the worst part was that my husband was involved in this crazy family situation. My husband David and I have been married for the last 8 years. We have a son together, Tom, who is 4 years old now. He's a very playful boy with a hyperactive imagination. Tom has always been very close to me and is a bit of a mama's boy, which doesn't bother me at all because I know that as soon as he becomes a teenager, he will have his own interests and may not want to spend as much time with me. David and I are great partners, and over the years, we've perfected our routine in managing the house and taking care of Tom, while also maintaining satisfying careers. Honestly, this harmony between us has been possible because I thought I had a very respectful and communicative husband like David. So, you can imagine, I didn't have anything to complain about on Reddit, right? Well, today I'm making this post about my husband's sister, Katie. I don't want to start by showing any bias towards her, but let's just say Katie is hard to get along with. She's always been cold with me from the very beginning, and this behavior has remained the same, even though David and I have been married for a long time. I remember when we first started dating, David told me his parents would approve of me easily, but his sister Katie would definitely interrogate me because she has always been very protective of him. Well, he was right. The first night we met with her, she asked me a ton of questions about my family, my childhood, and my siblings. No matter what I answered, she seemed unimpressed and kept her nose up the whole time. She also brought up David's ex-girlfriends in the middle of our conversation and compared me to them as if it were the most normal thing in the world. At one point during dinner, she invited David to join her and her friends on a girls' trip, telling him that he needed to clear his mind before getting serious with someone. This comment made me feel extremely uncomfortable, and I was visibly upset, which David noticed and politely asked his sister to calm down. Now, this is something that sometimes bothers me about my husband. Although he stands up to his sister, he's not really firm with his boundaries because of his affection for her. I guess this makes her think she can keep pushing the issue because she's the older sister, and according to her, only she has his best interests at heart. Since that first dinner date, I was convinced that Katie and I didn't get along. It hurt a bit, but I wasn't going to try to convince someone to love and accept me if they had already made up their mind. Despite this incident, I was always polite with her whenever we crossed paths, but she never made it easy for me. One particular incident that comes to mind is David's grandparents' anniversary party. They had invited the whole family, and I was invited as David's guest since we had been dating for a year. During the party, family members came up to me to start conversations, and honestly, I loved how relaxed and friendly his family was. The only person who didn't say a word to me, or even greet me, was Katie. I noticed this and kept my distance from her as much as possible. At one point, his grandparents asked everyone to gather for a group photo. As we were gathering, Katie pointed at me loudly and told me to leave the photo. David looked at her with raised eyebrows while Katie kept saying that maybe he would break up with me in the future and that she didn't want one of her brother's bimbos in the photo. My face turned red with embarrassment as everyone looked uncomfortable. David tried to argue, but Katie kept talking over him, saying that I was just a stranger and shouldn't even have come to this event. I had heard enough and felt completely humiliated. David had attended many of my family events and none of my relatives had treated him this way. I apologized and went back home to get the car keys. I had no intention of spending another minute with that woman. David and his parents ran after me trying to apologize. His mother tried to convince me to come back with them, but the moment had already been ruined. I could hear David's grandparents scolding Katie loudly, and I felt even more guilty for ruining the day. I immediately left, and that night, I even considered breaking up with David because I knew I couldn't deal with someone like his sister. However, David came to my house with flowers and cakes to apologize. He told me that everyone had scolded Katie for being rude to me and that he had threatened to cut ties with her as well, which apparently made her cry. He told me he was tired of his sister's antics and didn't want anything to do with her. We talked a lot, and I felt sure that he had defended me. In the days that followed, David kept his word. We stopped seeing Katie altogether, and he stopped answering her calls. Sometimes she showed up at his house unannounced, so he changed all the locks and asked his parents to talk to her so she would respect his private space. His parents supported his decision, so Katie had no choice but to accept that her brother didn't want anything to do with her. We thought this would make her reflect and regret how she treated me, but it had the opposite effect. She started calling me and sending threatening messages, blaming me for everything. The breaking point came when she showed up at my work one afternoon demanding to see me. Fortunately, my manager intervened and kicked her out, but I was really shaken. I told David that at this point, I had no choice but to break up with him to distance myself from his crazy sister, file a complaint against her, and take her to court for harassing me. David started crying when he heard this, begging me not to break up and pleading with me to give him a chance to fix things. He then convinced his parents to arrange a meeting between him and Katie at their house, where they finally had their last conversation. His parents knew what she had been doing to me and made it very clear that they didn't want anything to do with her. David and his parents warned Katie that her behavior was bordering on madness, and if she continued, they would support my decision to take her to court. Eventually, Katie broke down and admitted she needed help. She told them she had been spiraling and didn't know how to stop. She also revealed that she had lost her job and had been unemployed for several months, which had affected her mental health. Fortunately for her, David's parents intervened and admitted her to a psychiatric hospital immediately, where she could be closely monitored. David reiterated his desire to not have any contact with her, which Katie finally accepted. She sent me an apology message, which in my opinion seemed a bit insincere, but for her sake, I hoped she would heal. When David and I finally got married, we decided not to invite Katie, even though she had been discharged and seemed fine in her life. I didn't want anything to do with her, and everyone respected my wish. She sent me flowers congratulating me on my happy day, which I appreciated. Right after we got married and returned from our honeymoon, Katie announced that she was getting married. Everyone was surprised because no one knew she was dating anyone at the time, but at the same time, we were happy for her. However, we became concerned when we learned that she was dating a guy she had met during her time in the psychiatric hospital. To give you all the context, this guy, James, was schizophrenic and an alcoholic with volatile tendencies, according to his doctors. Understandably, David and Katie's parents were a bit concerned when they found out. Katie announced to everyone that her wedding would be next month, and that she only wanted David to be there, not me. I wasn't expecting it, and I was relieved that she hadn't invited me because it saved me the trouble of coming up with an excuse to avoid attending. However, my husband felt hurt that his sister only invited him and not me, so he didn't attend the wedding either. Those who attended the wedding later told us that it was a disaster. It turns out that Katie and James were completely drunk during the ceremony and couldn't even repeat the words after the priest properly. During the reception, James kept drinking and got so drunk that he started ripping his shirt and pants while everyone looked on in horror. Being schizophrenic, James didn't like being stared at and immediately attacked the event waiter, who was just an innocent bystander, shouting that the waiter looked suspicious and was hiding something. James's family finally calmed him down and convinced the waiter not to press charges by paying him off. However, this incident left everyone worried, and we were all quite concerned about Katie's safety. If James could attack a random stranger, what was the guarantee he wouldn't attack her? David and his parents tried to speak to Katie privately about her husband's strange behavior, but Katie seemed convinced that she could change him and have a good life. No matter how much her parents tried to warn her about the warning signs, she was sure that James would never hurt her. I wish I could write here that she was right, but as you can imagine, James treated her exactly the way everyone had warned her over the years. David and his parents tried to stay in touch with Katie, but James deliberately cut off her contact with anyone and prevented her from speaking to anyone. We couldn't make a case against him because Katie refused to accept help. On 2 occasions, we learned that the police had been called to their house because neighbors could hear them arguing and becoming physically violent. Despite everything, Katie never gave in and seemed convinced that he was the one for her. 4 years ago, I got pregnant with Tom and everyone was happy. For my baby shower, I wanted Katie to be part of the celebration, so we sent her an invitation. We never got a response from her, which worried us. David decided to drive to her house to see how she was. It turned out that James had completely cut her off from any communication with us and had thrown away our invitation so that she wouldn't even know about it. I don't know exactly what happened, but David understandably got angry, so he and James exchanged some heated words, which went nowhere, because Katie didn't think what her husband had been doing was wrong in any way. Frustrated, David left, and that was the last time we heard from her. We never contacted her again, not even when Tom was born. Her parents also stopped trying to convince her, and we all just prayed that she was okay. These last years after Tom's birth have been completely peaceful and filled with love. David and I never had major problems, and now we've reached a wonderful understanding and rhythm in our marriage. Tom is a very curious boy, and he keeps us busy with his antics. David's parents visit us every weekend, so they can take care of Tom for a few hours, while David and I have our weekly date. This gives us some free time, while the grandparents spend quality time with Tom. Everything seemed to be going well until 8 months ago when Katie showed up at our door, all dirty and disheveled. Her feet were filthy, and she had no shoes. We immediately let her in, and I ran to get her a blanket since she looked like she was shivering. We hadn't seen her in years, so we didn't know what to say. David kept stroking her hair and asking if she was okay. She seemed numb and wasn't looking at anything in particular. Finally, she revealed that she had just had a miscarriage. We sat there in shock as she continued telling us how she had gotten pregnant a month ago and thought James would be happy for her. At first he was, but as the weeks passed, he became more and more suspicious that the baby would drive her away from him and that she wouldn't love him the same. They fought a lot, and he threatened to mix rat poison into her food so she would lose the baby. Katie told us that she woke up that day feeling ill and, when she went to the doctor, she found out she had lost the baby. She felt so sick and numb that she couldn't get into the car and drive back home, so she decided to just walk. Somehow, her brain led her to our house. But I suppose she must have walked at least 20 blocks or more, barefoot, and she didn't remember why she had no shoes. I felt very sorry for her and immediately hugged her. It took her a moment to register the hug, but when she did, she returned it. We sat there for 5 whole minutes while Katie slowly cried in my arms. We knew at that moment that this was her way of asking for help. David seemed ready to confront James directly, but I convinced him to call the police and notify her parents, who would be better equipped to handle the situation. Her parents were incredibly grateful to have their daughter back and assured her they would support her no matter what. When the police took her statement, they were as shocked as we were by the multiple abuses Katie had endured in her marriage until that point and had kept silent about. James was immediately arrested, despite his protests and threats. He kept denying it until the end, claiming he had nothing to do with her miscarriage. However, according to Katie's statement, she had indeed been poisoned by him, which led to the loss of her baby. In summary, due to James's mental issues and his incompetence to stand trial, the judge sent him to a psychiatric facility for treatment indefinitely. This decision was obviously frustrating, but we were also thankful to have Katie back, safe and healthy. I have to clarify that all my previous feelings of animosity towards her had disappeared at this point. As a woman, I felt bad for her and wanted nothing more than to forget our past and move forward. I wished nothing but for Katie to heal. After this terrible experience, she also seemed calm around me and was no longer mean to me. When we felt she was ready, we introduced her to Tom, as we thought this would help her recover faster. She quickly grew close to Tom, which didn't bother us. I suppose this should have been my first red flag. Over the weeks, she found ways to spend more time with my son, showing up unexpectedly at our house without calling first. She was living with David's parents, so she could easily drive to our house. She insisted on bathing Tom and reading him bedtime stories, which at first seemed like a kind gesture. However, her increasing presence began to feel a bit strange. It reached the point where Katie was coming almost every day without notice and always found a reason to stay longer than necessary. She brought toys and gifts for Tom, always trying to get involved in his daily routines. She also made strange comments about his clothes or hairstyle, telling me how Tom would look better this way or that, which annoyed me a little. Although I appreciated her efforts to bond with him, it began to feel like she was reverting to her old ways of belittling me. However, this time, her target wasn't her brother, but my son, and my maternal instincts kicked in. I talked to David, who assured me that maybe I was overthinking it and that his sister was just trying to cope with her pain. He reminded me how she had just lost her baby, which made me feel guilty. So, I decided to let her be. If taking care of my son made her happy for a few minutes, what harm could it do? Over the days, I tried to be as understanding as possible with her constant presence in our home. She started looking after Tom every day while we were at work, and even took him to the park to play in the afternoon. Sometimes, when I came home, I noticed that my son didn't show the same excitement to see me as he always did. He didn't run to greet me and looked at me curiously. After Katie left, I tried talking to Tom about his day and if he had any issues with Katie being around, but he didn't engage much in the conversation. My usually cheerful son seemed sad and less enthusiastic. As a mother, I was very worried about this change in his behavior, but every time I tried to talk to my husband about it, he gently told me that I was just overthinking trivial things. David tried to reassure me that everything was in my head and that Tom was just growing up. However, the persistent feeling in my head kept bothering me. So, I talked to one of my coworkers about it, and she gave me the brilliant idea of buying surveillance cameras from Amazon, installing them in my son's room and in the living room to keep an eye on Tom. It was a clever idea, so I bought 2 cameras immediately. I never told David about it because I didn't want him to dismiss my feelings again. Yesterday, when I came home and after Tom went to bed, I decided to check the surveillance cameras I had installed. David was downstairs watching TV, so I sat in my office to watch the video, which also had audio. At first, I just saw Katie looking after Tom and playing with him. She seemed very good with kids. However, imagine my surprise when I saw Katie pull out a book from her bag, something I hadn't noticed before. Normally, we have age-appropriate books for our son in his room, but this book was different. She read the book to Tom before his afternoon nap. As I listened to the story, I realized it was about adoption and how sometimes a mother gives her child to another mother to take care of. While Katie read the story to my son, she added that this was why she had left Tom under my care all those years ago because she wasn't ready. Then my eyes opened in horror when she continued telling my son that she would always be his real mother and that no one could love him more than she did. She kissed his forehead and let him sleep. My hands were shaking with anger as I finally understood the garbage she had been feeding my son for who knows how long, which had clearly made him act strangely toward me. This poor child must have been terribly confused and simply didn't know what to believe. I was ready to rush downstairs and tell my husband never to let his sister into our house again, but something stopped me. Instead, I decided to take the day off to spend time alone with my son and find out exactly what Katie had been telling him to brainwash him. When I told Katie that she didn't need to come to take care of the child, she became hysterical, insisting that she loved spending time with my son. I firmly told her to step aside and that I wanted the day with my son. David asked me if I was okay, and I tried to assure him before bringing up the topic. I wanted to make sure my son felt safe around me. When I started asking him about what he and his aunt had been talking about, he became a bit quiet. I promised Tom that he wasn't in trouble in any way and that I just wanted him to know he could talk to me about anything. It was then that my son revealed the truth. He told me how Katie had been trying to convince him for weeks that she was his real mother, although he didn't really believe it. She also told him that eventually I would leave him because only real mothers love their children. Because of her persistence, he was afraid to ask me about it in case I really would send him away. He told me he loved me and didn't want to go live with Katie. Hearing those words broke my heart as I looked at his tearful face. He looked so small and vulnerable, in stark contrast to the cheerful, playful child I knew. I knelt down to his level, gently took his hands in mine, and reassured him that he had nothing to worry about and that David and I would take care of it. However, my son then informed me that David already knew everything. I asked him what he meant by that, and he replied, "I asked Dad. He knows about this, but he told me not to tell you." My blood drained from my face as I realized that, despite discovering what his sister had been doing, my husband had chosen to protect her instead of protecting our son. He already knew everything. I couldn't allow my son to be around these people. I didn't want my son to be confused and scared about his own mother. I am his mother, and it was my duty to protect him from this. I quickly drove home and we packed our bags. I told my parents I was going to stay at their house, and that if David asked, we would tell him I missed them and wanted to spend time with them. Fortunately, my parents are very understanding, so they didn't hesitate to say yes. As I write this, I have already talked to my parents about everything, and they are just as shocked as I am by what Katie has been telling my son. David called me when he must have returned to an empty house, but I tried to sound as normal as possible, telling him I needed a break from our home and work. He sounded curious, but I assured him I would stay with my parents for just a few days. We rarely argue, so I guess he didn't think much of it, although my behavior must have seemed strange to him. I'm so confused right now. I have no idea what I should do or how I should face this situation. Update 1. Wow, I woke up to almost 600 comments on my post. I can't believe so many people use Reddit and found my story. I used fake names in my narrative, so I hope none of David's relatives figure out that this is about him. Also, for those who are criticizing me in the comments for not talking to my husband first, I assure you that I definitely would have spoken to him if my son hadn't told me that he had tried to talk to David when he first found out. Call it motherly instinct, but the fact that my husband knew for weeks how my son had been acting differently with me and still made me believe it was all in my head shows that a confrontation with him wouldn't have led to anything constructive. I also wanted to get my son out of that situation immediately, and now he is much safer with my parents. No psychopath can feed him lies here, and that's the only thing that matters. Katie has tried to contact me several times, sending multiple messages insisting that she needs to see my son and how much she misses him. I plan to put an end to this once and for all at the upcoming family gathering at David's parents' house this weekend. This meeting has been planned for weeks on my part since David's grandparents are visiting, and I thought we could spend some quality time together. However, in light of recent events, I plan to use this opportunity to tell my truth and make sure Katie never comes near my son again. Update 2. Here I am, back with an update. I finally confronted David and Katie as I had planned during the family gathering. I was very nervous before going, but I decided to bring the nanny cam footage with me to have legitimate proof to show everyone. Without going into too many details, I got straight to the point and caught Katie's attention in front of everyone during lunch. She seemed agitated and tried to downplay it as if it wasn't a big deal. Then, I showed the nanny cam footage and told her how I had recorded what she had told my son. I saw the color drain from her face as I sent the video to the family group so they could all see what I was talking about. Her parents were horrified watching her try to convince my son that she was his real mom. After this, I confronted David and told him how he had failed to protect our son. My husband looked genuinely guilty, but tried to justify it by saying that he didn't think it was a big deal and that he thought this would help his sister cope with her pain. He felt torn between supporting his sister's recovery and telling me, but in the end, he chose to stay silent. I informed him that because of his actions, I no longer trusted him and couldn't allow my son to be near him or his family ever again. For the first time in a long time, I saw my husband break down in tears, but I didn't retract my decision. I told him I couldn't allow my son to grow up in a family where his father refused to defend him just to protect his mentally ill sister. David's parents and grandparents apologized and assured me that they would make sure Katie never came near our son again. Katie seemed completely humiliated, but didn't even have the decency to apologize. David continued to justify his actions, but I didn't pay attention. I left shortly after this confrontation because my work there was done and I no longer wanted to have anything to do with any of them. Update 3. I see that some of you are confused about my decision, so I wanted to clarify. Yes, I plan to divorce my husband. I know many of you wanted me to give him a second chance since this wasn't entirely his fault, and I agree that David is a good man. However, being a good man doesn't automatically make him a good father. The fact that my son and I have never had major problems doesn't mean he's been a good father to Tom. He should have stopped this from the beginning when our son came to him with doubts instead of spending weeks trying to cover it up and manipulate me. Both my son and I can no longer trust him. I accepted Katie back into my life with open arms after everything that happened because, as a woman, I felt pity for her. But in the end, she proved exactly why I never liked her in the first place. I understand that the abuse Katie suffered was extremely traumatic for her, but that doesn't mean our son should have to pay for it. She was an adult woman who clearly had mental issues from the start, but we thought she had improved. What really surprised me was my husband. The fact that he chose his sister's mental well-being over our son shows why he should never be near Tom. He was always such a supportive husband that I thought I could trust him, but since what happened with Katie, it's clear he wanted to protect her more than us. I promise that from now on I will protect my son no matter what. I'm confident I can get full custody of my son if I expose their family's story during the custody battle. Update 4. As quite a bit of time has passed and my divorce is final, I decided it was a good time for an update. First of all, I'm officially divorced from David and have obtained full custody because the judge saw that he wasn't a good father to Tom. What he did was wrong on many levels and questionable from any point of view, especially by backing his sister's behavior with our son. It was very disturbing. He will be able to see him, but only under supervision, as he can't be alone with him. As for his sister, his parents tried to make her see reason again because they didn't want to have her institutionalized again. But unfortunately, that wasn't possible, because she definitely needed professional help. It must be horrible as a parent to go through something like this, and I understand that they didn't want to go through it a second time, but I guess it's for the best for everyone. So that's all for now. With my ex-brother-in-law in treatment and my husband without custody, I can now focus on taking care of my son and moving on with my life peacefully.